Welcome to Atlas Live, Atlas Public Policy's video podcast that brings together industry and policy leaders for timely discussions about clean technology, transportation, the built environment, manufacturing, climate change, and more.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Atlas Live. I'm your host, Nick Nigro. Today, we're talking about an issue that's top of mind for households and businesses, and that's rising electricity bills. For many years, national average electricity prices were relatively stable after adjusting for inflation, but recently, changes have been more acute in certain states, and the reasons are complicated. Utilities are investing in aging infrastructure. Transmission and distribution systems need upgrades. Demand is changing, and states are trying to balance affordability and reliability, sustainability, and long-term investment. Data centers have gotten a lot of attention recently, and while that load growth has actually driven down electricity prices in the past, the recent spike in development may lead to the opposite effect. State regulators, utilities, consumer advocates, legislatures, and federal programs all play a role in shaping what customers pay and what investments move forward. And while everyone wants bills to be affordable, the path to getting there is just really not straightforward. So to help us unpack these issues, I'm pleased to be joined by two key state leaders, Dr. Zenon Christodoulou, Commissioner at the New Jersey Board of Public Utilities, more affectionately known as Dr. Z, and Josephus Allmond, the Chief Energy Officer for the Commonwealth of Virginia. We'll talk about what's driving higher electricity costs, how states are responding, and what tools policymakers have to protect consumers while continuing to build a reliable and modern grid. All right, guys, thanks a lot for joining us on the show. I'd love to jump right into it because we got a lot to cover in a short amount of time. So first and foremost, welcome to the show, guys.
Thanks so much for having us.
It's great to be here.
Awesome. Okay, so I mentioned at the top, inflation-adjusted price of electricity stayed pretty much flat and constant for many years. There's a famous chart that EEI used to share a lot that showed just how flat electricity prices had been for decades. But prices have risen faster than inflation across the country since 2022. So first and foremost, help us set the stage. Help us understand what's going on. What's causing this change? Why don't we start with Dr. Z?
Well, I think you bring up a good point that for the last 15 or so years, prices have been relatively flat. And we've been fortunate that our economy has been growing during that time, that energy prices really have not inflated as much as other costs. There are a lot of reasons for this. Our economy grew because we outsourced a lot of manufacturing, because Wall Street was doing pretty well. There were profit centers in other places. So the economy grew, but it wasn't really based on energy use. So the demand for energy didn't increase the prices in those simple economic equations of supply and demand. So demand stayed relatively flat as the economy grew. And then two things happened in the recent past. One is we've reshored a lot of our manufacturing. We continue to do that. We've also started to electrify buildings. Electric vehicles are something that we're all getting used to. And of course, data centers are creating an enormous demand, which we didn't have just a few years ago. At the same time, our supply of energy is undergoing a transformation from the older, traditional, still very fossil fuel-based energy generation to now more renewable sources, wind and solar and batteries. So we have this very interesting confluence of factors, increasing demand that we haven't faced in a long time, and reductions in supply that haven't been supplemented yet with renewable sources. So if you put those two things on collision course, that supply-demand imbalance leads to very high prices, and that's where we are now.
And it's really interesting that these things are, as you said, on a collision course. So, Josephus, what about from where you sit in Data Center Alley, if you will, in Virginia?
Yeah, I think we're sort of on the front edge of the effects of increased growth from data centers, like we're seeing throughout the country now. But it's been going up here in Virginia for a long time, and we have the most data centers by far for any state, and so what that's done is put enormous pressure not just on Virginia but on the PJM grid writ large, as that demand has sort of increased. And now I think that you mentioned the sort of transition, how we might be sort of now entering a phase where data center increased demand could start to increase bills. And I think we're sort of already at that point here in Virginia. Had a really important decision that came out Friday from our state corporation commission that will directly assign some costs of transmission that was, that data centers were the but-for cause of. And so we think that will help a lot going forward, sort of right-sizing where those transmission costs are allocated. But that's been the biggest reason here. And the growth in electric vehicles and building electrification really sort of dwarfs in comparison to the load we're expecting from data centers.
And I can imagine that Virginia kind of serving as the canary in the coal mine, if you will, for what the rest of the country might be experiencing soon. And so you brought up data centers there, and they certainly get a lot of attention in the media these days. They're top of mind for a lot of people. The research has shown in the recent past, that they weren't really responsible for the recent rate hikes in much of the country. But as you've alluded to, that's not necessarily the case in Virginia, and it might not be the case elsewhere moving forward. You mentioned, Josephus, one thing that the state of Virginia is doing. I'd love to hear more about what you all are considering, either at the commission or elsewhere within government, to help address these cost challenges that you're facing. And then we'll go over to Dr. Z to get his perspective from New Jersey's.
Yeah, I think fortunately our SCC, the State Corporation Commission, our BPU, what New Jersey has up there, have been really proactive on this issue. And so, going back to 2025, held a technical conference, which was a sort of first of its kind at the Virginia Commission on data centers to look at some of those issues. And then in last year's rate case for Dominion, the commission established a large load rate class, the GS5 class. And that has some important protections, increased collateral requirements, also has minimum demand charges for generation, transmission, and distribution. That way, if a data center sort of overestimates the capacity they need, they still have to pay for a set amount of that 14-year period. So I think we will start to see some of the impacts from that rate class, but it doesn't come into effect until January 1, 2027. So, a couple other places like Ohio, and I just saw the Exelon forecast, once they implemented their large load tariff reforms, they had a significant drop in forecasted data center load because it weeded out a lot of speculative projects that are in there. So excited for that class to come into effect. But then also, we think there are some things to be done on cost allocation that can help, ensure that residential and bills for small businesses are remaining low.
Before we get into the cost allocation, I want to get over to you, Zenon, about like what you think New Jersey could be doing right now when it comes to this issue, because I know it's a top issue within the government right now.
Yeah, it really is. Affordability is such a key issue now that we're all experiencing. So let's look at the kind of PJM footprint, because I think that's representative of what's happening all over the country as well. It's not just a state by state thing. It's much more regional because that's how the grids are built. So the transmission costs, and we'll try to figure out how to allocate appropriate costs to people who are actually benefiting. It's not so easy, incidentally, to figure out who benefits from a 13-state electric grid. Every time you add a transmission line or a new source of generation, these are very complicated. I mean, extremely complicated, almost to the point of impossibility to really get it right. So we take a lot of educated guesses. But as just said, to weed out some of those speculative projects. Ohio, for example, initially there were 30 gigawatts of proposed data centers. And when they added certain deposit guarantees, that number dropped to somewhere around 6. So they went from 30 because people figured, hey, let's do it. If it doesn't cost us anything, let's just get in line for Space Mountain. And only when you realize, oh, wait a minute, you got to pay for a speed pass. They take off and go to, it's a small world ride instead. So I think those government programs are going to help weed them out. But the key problem here is that it is an extremely speculative process, and the load forecasting that we're anticipating is honestly, I don't think anybody knows. I think it's anybody's guess on this, and that's really the biggest problem. Because if we assume that we're going to say add 10 or 20% on to what our grid needs to accommodate in terms of generation emission, if we build to that and only 10% comes in, as Josephus said, we're putting certain guarantees on for 10 or 14 or 15 years. But these transmission projects last for 60. So that means there's 45 or 50 years, hypothetically, where the ratepayers are going to be on the hook for this, something which may or may not be used in a decade or two. So this is a real speculative process. I don't know how we get it right. Whatever happens, we're going to look back in 10 or 20 years and we're going to say we were either wrong or we were really wrong, because it's highly unlikely that we're going to get it right.
Yeah, no, I hear that for sure. And one of the things you mentioned reminds me of what I hear a lot of clean energy advocates say, particularly those who are focused on decarbonization. And they say, having all this excess capacity is going to be great for building electrification, for electric vehicles and other sources. But, you need that load to come onto the grid for those, assets to be really utilized. So, Josephus, I want to go back to you because you talked about cost allocation and such. And I want to try to get a little bit into the details, if we can, on, either the rate making process or other sort of policy solutions. So we step back and look at like what's happened with rate making in the last several decades. We've had various things kind of bubble up as quote unquote good practice. In the 80s, decoupling emerged as a solution. More recently, performance-based rate making has become very popular. Do we have the regulatory tools that we need right now to get this as close to right as possible? As Dr. Z said, we're not going to be right, but hopefully we'll be close. Or there are newer strategies we should really start to explore. And one other, caveat to all of this that we haven't mentioned yet that keeps coming up in my mind is energy efficiency and whether or not we're leaving that behind. So what do you think about that, Josephus?
Yeah, I think some really good reforms, and I think they're sort of, I think they exist already, so we don't need to sort of go out and do something new. On cost allocation, and this will change a little bit depending on what state you're in, what utility you're with, but Dominion, for example, that's Virginia's largest utility. They still use something called the average and excess methodology to allocate costs for generation and distribution. And so that methodology dates back to like the 70s when we were also coming out of a period of significant growth, but that growth in the 50s, 60s, 70s was driven by air conditioning proliferating throughout suburbia, right? And so you had these very peaky loads that everyone was cutting on at the same time. And so the cost allocation methodologies that really emerged to address those peaks and to allocate more costs to the users causing those peaks. Data centers are not very peaky users. They use a pretty constant amount of electricity. So in that methodology, they're allocated a much lower percentage of costs. Moving from that older, outdated average and excess methodology to something more modern, like probability of dispatch or hourly cost models that are more based on energy use, I think would allocate more costs to the data centers and I think more accurately reflect how electricity is moving on our system today versus 50 years ago.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up because it's basically switching the sort of the methodology from power to energy. So Zenon, what do you think of that?
Yeah, well, first to Josephus's point, absolutely right. We experienced this, a couple of generations ago, but that was a very different environment because, the term that we use today is demand response. When there was a suburban home that turned on the air conditioning And I remember this because we had fuse boxes, right? We still do in homes. And if it would blow a fuse, you'd know to turn the TV off, turn some lights off, and then you could turn your air conditioning on. That was an early kind of primitive form of demand response. So that was kind of offloaded to the individual consumer. Now we have to figure out some ways for large scale load centers to really turn down their usage at the right times and to coordinate. That's not so easy. The data centers, which is an enormously important issue for our country. We need to maintain our national security and our economic competitiveness. Data centers and AI are critical in that pursuit. So it's not like should we or shouldn't we? The fact is we absolutely need data centers. The question is how many, where are they located, and then who pays for all this? So regardless of whether they pay for the transmission costs, which they will, and they'll do it willingly, because they're going to make so much money. Whoever survives, whichever one of the Magnificent Seven survive all this in terms of the AI dominant force, any dollar value is worth it. I mean, hyperscale data centers are anticipated now to make somewhere in the order of $19 million a day in profit, $600 million a month. Money is no object for them. They'll pay for that. The problem is for consumers. At what point, two things, they'll pay for transmission, but generation issues are still going to be limited. There's still only so many turbines we can build in the next 5 or 10 years. Nuclear is not going to come on for a decade. Demand response is still being worked on, and batteries are still in their infancy. So there's still going to be enormous cost drivers. Whether or not data centers pay their own way, and even more than their own way for transmission, prices will continue to rise. And to make the transition to clean renewable energy, which we must, prices are going to increase even more. So that's something I think we have to prepare our economy for, that there's no cost reduction in sight. It's going to have to come from, as you said, energy efficiency, conservation, communication, and education with consumers and businesses to understand how they can shave the peaks. I think it's 8 or 10 hours a year that we pay for so much of this extra capacity just to make sure on the hottest days and the coldest days that we could stay cool and warm. So we need to figure out ways to engage people to lower those peaks so we don't have to overbuild for those few hours a year.
Yeah, I'd love to hear more from both of you on that particular topic, just because, for quite a while there was considerable push from the policy community to focus on energy efficiency, whether it be through programs at the federal level, like Weatherization Assistance Program, or LIHEAP, the Low Income Home Energy Assistance Program. Lots of states have energy efficiency programs like Mass Save and others. And to some extent, some of those programs are under threat at the federal level for a variety of reasons. But at the state level, they're looking at energy affordability. And some have thought that by cutting some of these energy efficiency programs, they'll be able to at least give ratepayers some money back. Is that where you guys sit? Is that a good long-term solution? Is that part of the calculus for how to get energy affordability in the near term, or is that kind of a fool's errand?
Where should we start? Josephus,
you got it. Go ahead.
Sure.
Go ahead, yeah.
So look, affordability is critical at this point. You may or may not know, but I was the national chair for affordability committee at NARUC, the National Association, and it's been something near and dear to my heart because I see the importance of this. But let me tell you that the community has not really settled on a definition of what affordability is. And I myself can see it in multiple different ways. I mean, is affordability fairness? Like cost causation, you cause this cost, so it's only fair for you to pay it. Is it a matter of being accurate, in an accounting sense, like with rate cases, and when we look back to make sure that expenses were just and prudent, or is it more of a moral dimension to be affordable? And then we can figure out short-term or long-term, and the group, the individual, and then ultimately efficiencies. I mean, does affordability reflect the efficiency of a market, of a free market mechanism to find the lowest cost through cost savings and competition to drive costs down, and that's the efficiency level? I really don't know how we define affordability. We kind of know it when we see it. What we're doing in New Jersey and what we've done for the last 2 years is to give certain bill credits to people who are least able to pay. but that's not sustainable for the long term.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually, there's no free lunch. Eventually, the money runs out. And I'm not going to say which states I've been talking to, but there are a lot of states that are running out of money. We see the budgets. This
Mm-hmm.
can't go on forever. There has to be a different and a more durable way to achieve affordability. And that has to come from energy efficiency. It has to come from managerial efficiencies on behalf of the transmission owners and the utilities, to find ways to lower costs for everyone so it doesn't burden the system into bankruptcy. These very distortive allocations of capital resources to just one sector of the economy is really going to crowd out investments in other urgent sectors to keep us nationally competitive and keep people employed. It's very complicated, but I think we need to look at the very large picture for the long term. And although short term is very important, the here and the now, I have not, quite frankly, seen on a national scale the long-term vision of how this plays into the economy long-term and how it keeps our nation strong. I haven't seen that kind of vision.
Speaking of leaders, Josephus, your boss was in part elected because of this issue, to really take this issue on, to take it head on. And there's been a lot of action in Virginia. You mentioned some of it already. But let's try to close the loop on this. Should we be expecting more from Virginia? Dr. Z talks about the need for more sustainable long-term solutions. Is Virginia still working through what that looks like in your state, or do you have it mapped out?
I think at least for Reggie, I think is a good example of how we've sort of mapped out a more durable path forward. And so Reggie's the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. Virginia joined back in 2020, was in the program for a few years. I think the last year we were in the program, it sort of brought in about $300 million of revenue. Governor Youngkin pulled us out of the program. A court found that to be unlawful, and that was one of the governor's big priorities coming in office, was to get us back into Reggie. A wrinkle in the sort of interim from the last time we joined is that allowance prices more than doubled in that time period. And so instead of revenue coming from the program about $300 million per year, we saw when Dominion made their first filing that it was going to be $1.1 billion over that first rate year. And so what we did with the governor's office and working with our colleagues in the legislature was help draft basically a refund. And so now 45% of all Reggie proceeds collected in Virginia will go back to customers in the residential and small general service class. That's 25 kW and below, so small businesses and churches. And so the effect of that for residents and small businesses and churches is that they're going to see a net reduction to their bills as a Reggie credit, as opposed to what the utility is projecting as a $13 a month increase if we hadn't have done that. So now folks will actually be looking at about $3 a month net decrease to their bills, while still generating over $600 million for energy efficiency programs and flood resilience programs. So I think that's a good example to show that the two, clean energy progress or progress on energy efficiency, doesn't have to be mutually exclusive with affordability.
Yeah, it's a good example of keeping the polluter pays principle alive and kicking. So appreciate that spotlight, Josephus. So let's talk a little bit about what's happening here in Washington. I mentioned earlier LIHEAP and the weatherization assistance programs. These programs are currently under threat, and to some extent from the federal government, either through changes in procedures, potentially funding changes and such. Dr. Z, you mentioned earlier, there's no free lunch. These things can't, potentially some of these subsidy-based programs can't last forever. Does New Jersey count on these programs in the long term, or are you now looking to a future where these programs aren't present any longer?
No, we have to look to the federal government for this. And we pay a lot of taxes into the federal government. We get a fraction of that back. We're one of the states with the lowest return on money sent to Washington. I think Congressman Josh Gottheimer from New Jersey has called the other states around us moocher states. I think that's a good North Jersey term. He's right about that because we give a lot of money in, we don't get much back. Those programs are critical for states. Our federal tax dollars have to they go somewhere. We need to get some of it back to help our people. The LIHEAP program and weatherization are critical to keep the lights on. And this is not just, electricity energy is not just a commodity or a good or service. It's essential. If people don't have access to affordable and reliable energy, businesses go out of business, people are unemployed, and God forbid people die. I mean, on hot days, if people can't cool off, the human body needs certain things. This is just a very important thing for us to remember. Additionally, and we sometimes forget, as regulators, we go to the topic du jour, unfortunately, and we lose sometimes the whole balancing act. Now it's affordability, but there is also a very real issue with climate change. And there are some really important issues that we can't forget, that sometimes we get distracted. We say, okay, wait a minute, this is too expensive, so we're going to forget it. Offshore wind was an example. So many subsidies into solar and batteries. These are critical long-term additions. We have to figure out really on a larger scale what we're going to do for our collective future. Reshoring manufacturing. We can't keep buying solar panels from China. We've got to figure out ways to do it here. We've got to come up with better battery technology. And just to the point about Reggie, I think it's a good case study, is that unless the whole region, and in fact, the whole country, adopts certain parameters and certain fundamental principles on pollution, it hurts more than it helps. I'll give you an example. In New Jersey, being part of Reggie, it raises the cost for gas generation. So what does that do? It actually encourages coal generation in West Virginia, Ohio, and Kentucky. Makes it relatively cheaper. So they produce more. I don't know if you guys realize, but pollution goes up in the air and it travels. So New Jersey, air pollution has actually gotten worse because we entered Reggie, not because of what we're producing, but because of what's being produced next to us. So some of these policies require federal coordination, because turning the music off in your house and your neighbor's blasting salsa until 3 a.m. doesn't really help you get to sleep. So it has to be more of a holistic, larger solution, not state by state. A region is a good start, but it really has to be larger in the future. It has to be wide.
Yeah, well, I've been in DC for over 15 years, and there was a run taken at capping emissions and putting a price on carbon at the national level.
Not easy. Not coming anytime soon.
Yeah, not coming anytime soon. But I want to stick with you for just one more follow-up, and that's on the role of renewables and batteries here in the affordability challenge. Because you look at the the queue going in that utilities send to EIA every month, and they're very clear. For the next few years, batteries, solar are going to dominate what capacity is being added to the grid. Is this going to actually help affordability? Is this something that is just sort of winding out the tax incentives, or winding down the tax incentives from the Inflation Reduction Act? Is this what the future looks like when it comes to addressing affordability, or is this sort of the last gasp? And Zenon, what do you think of that?
I think this is a critical step. It's a small step. It's a marginal step forward. Truthfully, solar is an important component of this. We need to keep moving forward. Wind may make a resurgence at some point. Offshore wind maybe will come back in 5 to 10 years in a different form, but it'll still be generated by blowing wind. That's going to be with us. Cost-wise, though, that's really the big issue. And solutions. Do the marginal contributions of solar and batteries solve this multi-gigawatt shortage? Maybe in 10 or 15 years. But even that, there's an intermittency, as we know from renewables, that requires batteries. Batteries are getting cheaper. But does that really help us get out of the base load issue? Fortunately, we're also looking at nuclear, and nuclear is coming on. I'm hoping that we can keep moving in that direction because I think that's a great solution. And then, Nick, what I'd like to also suggest, long-term solutions are going to require a very different way of thinking and very different technology. We always look big, big, big because we want a transmission system that is larger than a potential storm or catastrophe. But there's another way of looking at these things, and these are smaller. And we know all about microgrids, and we know all about kind of small energy storage, vehicle to everything. We can't lose sight of those very important VPPs because I think that is another way of solving this problem that will probably save a lot of cost. And I venture to guess that in 50 years, our grandkids or our great grandkids are going to look at old pictures with these transmission lines and distribution lines all over the place and trees knocking them down. And then they're going to say, "What were you thinking, Grandpa? Why did you go that way?" I think when technology changes, it will be a paradigm shift in how we generate and deliver energy. And I hope I'm alive to see it.
Yeah. I appreciate the optimism there. And, so Josephus, over to you on this renewables question. There was a thread that was running through the clean energy community a few years ago where it's like, oh, this data center load is growing like crazy and you can't get a natural gas turbine because, the queue is too long. If you want one, wait till you're in the 2030s. So when we look ahead to that time period now, a few years later, we are seeing natural gas come back online in the queue in that way. But in between that is renewables and batteries. And so the question to you is, what's that mix look like? And what is the role of renewables and batteries once natural gas and more natural gas starts coming online in a few years?
Yeah, I think VPPs are going to play a really important part of this, like Dr. Z mentioned. I think I might be a little more bullish on the grid scale and C&I batteries than Dr. Z, but I did some modeling at my old organization as a part of a utility IRP a couple years ago, and we found ways to basically meet all of this expected demand without building new gas, but that meant building a lot of storage in the interim, and then pairing that with a significant build out of nuclear fusion or fission in the 2030s. But I think batteries are already there, and in PJM, we're looking at PJM is predicting a capacity shortfall in 28, 29 delivery here. To your point, Nick, you can't build a gas plant before then. So batteries are, from a temporal perspective, the only thing that can meet the moment. And unlike their counterparts on the, peaker side that are going up and up and up in price, batteries keep coming down in price every year. So that plus the, retention of the investment tax credit through 2033. I'm bullish on batteries. I know the governor is, and that's why we prioritized a big storage build out. Before this year, Dominion's energy storage target was 2.7 gigawatts. Now they've got a 16 gigawatt target. 4 gigawatts of that has to come by 2030. And they've also got a 4 gigawatt long duration target. So we see that as a critical way to, keep prices down in the near term and capitalize on a technology that's declining in cost.
Yeah, we've covered this a few times on Atlas Live. You've got GM Energy, you've got Ford Energy, you've got Panasonic redoing one of their lines that was going to be for EV batteries, but moving it to energy storage. You've got a clear rush to try to build as much grid storage capacity as possible. And, thankfully for the country's sake, we have a lot of manufacturing capacity for that purpose. And so it's great to see the companies sort of rising to the occasion in that way to meet that demand that you're talking about and that shortfall that exists in PJM and elsewhere. So we're just about out of time. So I want to close with a question to you all about, getting people involved. I don't know how many people in either in the policy community or even in the public who've ever been to a utility commission proceeding. It is not for the faint of heart. It's very technical, it's very involved, but it really has an impact on everyone's pocketbooks. We've got ratepayer advocates who are present there to try to represent the interests of the public. We also have other advocates, either representing the interests of the environment or companies and such. But I would love to hear you all's perspective on what you recommend folks do. Either, our audience is generally the policy community, but also, speak to the public about what should they be doing right now, and how should they be thinking about energy affordability and what their role is in addressing this challenge in the near term. Why don't we start with you, Dr. Z?
Sure. You know what? The rate cases and our proceedings are kind of technical, but I'm very happy when people don't show up, because they usually don't come with roses. And so when they show up, they're usually very angry, and they have every right to be. We did, I think, collectively as an industry, a pretty bad job preparing people for what might have come.
Mhm.
There were a lot of smart people over the last 5 and more years, 5, 6, 7 years, who saw this shortfall coming. And you don't need to be an advanced economist to understand, when supply drops, prices go up. So we did a bad job preparing people to lower their demand at a time when supply was also being curtailed. So we need to communicate better with people. We need to, I think, really educate them and explain that they can take an active role to reduce their own costs, and that it is a collective effort, which we really don't reach out to people enough. I don't think we do a good enough job communicating that message. I don't think at the utility level, at the state, legislative level, or at the PUC level, the boards of public utilities and things, we need to get out there and explain to people how they can lower their prices, both directly by lowering their usage, and then indirectly, and that's the more complicated explanation, indirectly by shaving those peaks, those few times a year, when if we could lower that, it lowers the prices for everybody at all times. And also, so important to have an understanding of flexible rates, of time of use charges, and when it's better for them to do their dishes, when it's better for them to run a little laundry. I don't think we have explained to people how much they can help themselves, and we need to.
Josephus, close us out here.
Yeah, I'll just say, and this coming from someone who spent 6 years before this job litigating at our state commission, I would say show up and provide public comment, and especially if you're able to do that in person. I remember the 2024 case for Appalachian Power Company, the utility that serves us out in the far southwest corner of the state, was proposing a really significant rate hike, and folks out in that corner of the state really showed up for that hearing and told really personal stories about tough choices, impossible choices between paying an electricity bill and paying for food or paying for medicine. And those type of stories, I think, are what makes these things real. And the commission in that case ended up approving, I think, less than 1/10 of the revenue requirement that the utility was seeking, which is pretty low for typical requests.
For sure.
So I would just say, if you have the ability, show up and tell your story in person. I think that allowing these commissioners to see the people that their decisions impact, I think, is really impactful.
Yeah, and there is the adage of the squeaky wheel, gets the grease, and I think you close us out with a really valuable version of that, where people get to explain what their experience would be if a policy goes forward, and to have the government react and take care in how they proceeded with their decision is an optimistic way of looking at that interaction between the public and government. So I really appreciate you sharing that story. And it's a great way to close us out for this episode. So I just want to say thank you to Dr. Z and to Josephus for joining us on Atlas Live. We'll be back again short with another episode. Thanks.
Thanks for joining this episode of Atlas Live, Atlas Public Policy's video podcast. You can follow the show on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you choose to listen.